Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Russian spies are getting creative, targeting refugees and migrants for espionage inside NATO countries. They're preying on society's most vulnerable. But when caught, Moscow pretends that they don't exist. Now, if you're fleeing war, poverty, or persecution, Russia's spy agencies might just offer you a new job, without mentioning that it comes with prison time and absolutely zero health insurance. Now, let's unpack this Kremlin masterpiece. Here's our latest report to find out more.
A wave of covert sabotage operations linked to Russia has swept across Europe over the past 2 years, targeting critical infrastructure, military assets and communication networks in what experts describe as an escalating shadow war. According to a new report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the number of suspected Russian sabotage incidents in Europe nearly quadrupled between 2023 and 2024. These ranged from underwater cable disruptions in the Baltic Sea to interference with water supply systems and arson attacks on warehouses and military equipment in multiple countries. Rather than relying on intelligence offices, Russian agencies now employ a growing web of criminal proxies, offering a valuable factor of plausible deniability. This new model of sabotage has led to a surge in unsophisticated but highly disruptive attacks. Europe's vulnerability stems partly from decades of underinvestment in infrastructure. Much of NATO's logistical and communications backbone depends on civilian-owned systems, often prioritizing efficiency over security. Sweden is currently investigating the suspected sabotage of over 30 telecom towers along its coast. The IISS has noted a decline in sabotage in early 2025. Potential causes could include NATO deterrence operations like Baltic Sentry, dragging diplomatic efforts with the US, and fears of provoking NATO. However, the drop could be short-lived, allowing for regrouping and followed by a renewed offensive.
And now let's zone in on the East planning portion of our show. Russia is not waiting for a formal declaration of war. Through sabotage, cyber attacks, and disinformation, Moscow is already waging a hostile campaign on NATO soil, one continually escalating in scale and ambition.
The Kremlin's hybrid offensive, supercharged by its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has surged since 2022. Arson, infrastructure sabotage, election interference and covert intelligence gathering missions now form the backbone of its shadow war. From Russian military intelligence GRU-directed sabotage to the use of local proxies and commercial vessels operating as covert agents, the Kremlin has adapted old playbooks to new fronts. Its targets are wide-ranging: military bases, pipelines, logistics hubs, and the very institutions of democracy. Poland, a critical node for NATO logistics, has faced cyber attacks, arson, and electoral interference. In the Baltic states, Russian operatives have struck undersea cable systems and public infrastructure. Romania annulled the first round of its 2024 presidential election following confirmed Russian meddling, only to face further cyber attacks in 2025. Meanwhile, disinformation networks amplify the damage, spreading confusion and distrust among member states. NATO, recognizing the scale and persistence of Russia's hybrid campaign, has ramped up a series of countermeasures aimed at deterring and preventing the attacks. The Undersea Infrastructure Coordination Cell, along with Operation Baltic Sentry, operate to safeguard key undersea cables and pipelines. In parallel, the EU and NATO have formed a joint task force designed to improve protections for energy systems, communication lines, and transport hubs. What was once dismissed as peripheral strife has now hardened into tangible confrontation. The scale and coordination behind these attacks have left little doubt. This is not a future threat, it is a present conflict, and NATO can no longer afford to look away.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, NATO has ramped up counterintelligence efforts, making it increasingly hard for Russian spies to do their jobs the old-fashioned way. Pretending to be diplomats, slipping cocktails at embassy events, and casually asking, "So, what kind of weapons are we sending Ukraine this week?" But don't worry, Russia has found a new espionage strategy, and predictably, it's awful. Facing expulsion of hundreds of so-called diplomats, spies, and crippling sanctions, Russia has taken espionage underground quite literally, targeting migrants, refugees, and other vulnerable populations to do their dirty work. Now, this new recruitment method isn't exactly James Bond sipping martinis glamorous. It's more desperate and morally bankrupt, which frankly is exactly the Kremlin style. Recent revelations from the Czech Security Information Service confirm that Russia's FSB is using platforms like Telegram to lure migrants into espionage and sabotage, exploiting their isolation and economic desperation. And it's not just the Czechs. Polish authorities recently arrested refugees from Ukraine and Belarus who were recruited by the FSB to install hidden cameras at key railway hubs to monitor NATO's vital supply routes into Ukraine. And the worst part? Well, most of these recruits have no idea they're working for Moscow until they're arrested. Now, when things inevitably go south, Moscow responds with complete denial, like being ghosted after a Tinder date, but instead of awkward texts, you get prison time. Before the invasion, Russian spies mostly relied on embassies for cover, mingling at diplomatic receptions and cultural centers. But since NATO nations caught on to this scheme, expelling spies by the dozen, Moscow's tactics have shifted drastically. Now, the Kremlin targets refugees fleeing war, poverty, or persecution, groups already marginalized, vulnerable, and desperate. It's textbook exploitation, precisely the kind you'd expect from an administration whose moral compass was apparently lost at birth. Now, these unsuspecting individuals become disposable pawns in Putin's game, tasked with small-scale operations like arson, sabotage, and espionage, aimed not just at gathering intelligence, but at creating panic and division. In reality, Russia's recruitment tactics don't seek valuable intelligence. Their goal is simpler: create chaos, mistrust, and social tension. Every incident, no matter how small, is a victory in their eyes, weakening NATO's resolve to continue supporting Ukraine. Ultimately, the Kremlin strategy relies on exploiting human misery. NATO's challenges is clear: bolster counterintelligence, protect vulnerable populations, and maintain social cohesion. Moscow bets on division, but unity and vigilance are our strongest defense. Tonight's lesson: the Kremlin spies are disposable, but NATO's resolve should never be. And now, here to share more light on the issue is Mark McNamee, a co-founder of Ukraine Business News Network. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So today we're trying to unpack this recent phenomenon of Russians recruiting, be it migrants, be it refugees, to carry out some of their sabotage actions. Do you think that this is a new type of sabotage, or is it a more sign of a desperation?
Well, it's a new form of sabotage, I suppose, because historically Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union, had relied on more traditional espionage in terms of just their embassies across Europe and the United States, of course, filled with with spies. So this is a little bit new insofar as they're finding new avenues, new profiles of people, new demographic categories to attract or bring into the fold to help them achieve their consistent mission, which is, of course, is to undermine the Western order, make Russia, relatively speaking, vis-a-vis the West, look more powerful and stronger than it actually is in reality. So it's new in that regard in terms of how they do their operations, but the mission is still the same. So we shouldn't discount this. And frankly, it's a little bit maybe even more reckless currently, considering Russia is a very active kinetic war going on, attacking an EU aspiring nation, a Western nation in Ukraine. And a part of that, from Putin's point of view, this is another leg, right? Another dimension of this same war, this hybrid warfare, in terms of undermining, exploiting social divisions in different European countries, undermining social cohesion in various ways, of course, going more directly after the political and military support for Ukraine specifically. This is all part of the same operations Russia's conducted historically. It's just in a somewhat different way now, because since 2014 with greater sanctions, but 2022 in particular with the departure of so much embassy staff and not the departure, but the expulsion of embassy staff from these European nations, it forced them to find different avenues for conducting their hybrid warfare.
All right, how effective do you think this is? You mentioned something very important here about the sowing social division as well as, well, kind of hurting social cohesion within countries. And a lot of times they use, be it migrants, be it refugees, some of them even like Ukrainian or from countries that already kind of have a little bit of tension and polarization there. Do you think that these type of sabotaging action will actually exacerbate the polarity within the country?
Well, sure. I mean, that's the goal, and they wouldn't be pursuing that unless they thought it had legs, right, so to speak, unless there was some sort of track record of an ability to exploit these existing divisions. Because that's the point. Russia doesn't invent suddenly new issues, whether it be in the United States or in Europe, to then somehow come to the fore and then undermine these nations politically, socially, economically, what have you. They just find the existing issues that are there, that have been there for, generations, for decades, and then they find avenues to exploit them and exacerbate these tensions. And you mentioned actual recruitment of people specifically, right? Maybe underprivileged, refugees, migrants. People don't have legal protections in these countries. And so they already maybe feel disenchanted, they feel alienated, so they're naturally an attractive avenue to go after. But I would also highlight Russia's continued work, which has been extraordinarily effective for the last really about 20 years, in terms of allying, partnering, funding NGOs, different charities, think tanks, politicians themselves, helping political parties outright across Europe. This is extremely damaging, and by the way, it still, to some degree, continues. Holding international forum, justifying Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and undermining the Western conventional narratives as to what started the war, for example, who's at fault, creating disinformation, misinformation about well-accepted phenomenon like the war crimes, like the kidnapping that Putin has been committing, the kidnapping of children, the downing of the recent anniversary of the downing of the Dutch airliner MH17, just throwing more mud into the airspace, so into the media space, so people can't quite maybe evaluate what is true and what is not, and Russia has achieved its aims that way. So I'm answering your question to highlight the fact that yes, there's in terms of sort of direct sabotage by people, right? But sabotaging the sort of the political space and the media environment, and making society, making citizens of the Western world question just the explanation for everyday conventional phenomenon, that has been a remarkable achievement, and it continues to be a very effective achievement. And we see people in the United States, for example, in the White House, repeating directly, word for word, verbatim, Kremlin narratives that they publish consistently. So these are obviously, unfortunately, impacting policymaking out of Western countries.
Okay, so when we examine how Russia's been functioning, being in their economy, being in their own political system, or on the front line, it doesn't seem like they have so much coordination. But when it comes to the information space, it does seem like they are very effective as well. Where do you think this kind of disparity come from? And do you think that this thing mostly have legs because, well, most of the Western countries are already experiencing polarization, and Russia just have to kind of push things over the edge?
Yeah, more of the latter. I think that's the point. I wouldn't give Russia too much extreme credit here for what they've been able to accomplish. First of all, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, they're exploiting existing divisions. Okay, so they're not creating something new. They're just simply worsening issues that already have existed for years. Secondly, frankly, I don't think it takes that extraordinary amount of talent or coordination or strategy or administrative excellence in order to conduct these various misinformation, disinformation, sabotage campaigns that have been going on for years now across Europe, okay, Western Europe, Central Europe, right, Russia's closest neighbors. So this is more of an issue of they have money, they have intent, and they haven't been fought back against adequately. This is partially a problem of inadequate response by the West. We have the resources, we have the ability to stop and push back against this, and we simply do not, at least adequately enough. Now, that trend has improved recently in the last couple of years, now that the Western world has clearly identified Russia as the threat that it is, the comprehensive threat, security, political, economic, et cetera, social threat that Russia is. So we're seeing the trend improving lately, but we're so far away from repelling Russia in the way that we can and should. So I think it's not necessarily extraordinary ability of the Russian government and their coordination. It has more to do with it's relatively easy to do, and there isn't enough pushback from and protection within the West against these assaults.
All right, so can you help us unpack that a little bit? What would adequate response look like in your opinion? And if you were the advisors to Western nations, be it Europe, be it the United States, what would you suggest them do in order to respond to these type of actions?
Well, I mean, for one, why not tit for tat cyber attacks? Russia's conducting these all the time. We have far more in quantity, far more cyber professionals who are capable of doing this. We have funding resources to be able to do this. I'm not saying we have to destroy the Russian state and attack them, but we can protect ourselves better and attack them to the point where it would have a constraining effect on them. It would then contain their aggression, knowing that for every attack that they do, they can get hit far harder. So that would be one area. Secondly, is actually going after we have clear financial linkages between so many of these politicians, these NGOs, these think tanks, these charitable organizations that exist in the West that justify Russia's international behavior. Address them, go after them more strongly. In addition, I mean, the Trump administration, since his inauguration in January, has dismantled a few organizations that were tracking, for example, Russian war crimes. Likewise, in the cyber field, we need to, of course, move in the opposite direction and in coordination with the other Western allies to be protecting ourselves more against this. So my answer is that we need to protect ourselves better. So that means you go after the people and the organizations within the Western world who have been, co-opted or blackmailed or paid into this by the Russian government to be undermining our own societies. But then also an offensive component, which would then have a containing effect to deter Russia over the long term.
So do you think that this might also have unintended consequences when you go after these people to be seen as kind of politically motivated and thus exacerbating some of the polarization that we might be seeing already?
Sure, of course. I mean, and that's been a consistent problem. That has to do with, unfortunately, particularly in the United States, the high level of political tribalism that exists. And so people will only believe the truth that comes, their believed truth that comes from, the people who sort of lead their movements or their political party. So yes, of course, that's a problem. We have to rely on the strengths of the Western system. We do live in transparent, open societies for whatever faults and problems that we are aware of, and also the court system and a rule of law system. And so we progress these things to the court. You demonstrate evidence. And we trust our systems and institutions to hold up to this. And frankly, I say that because there's no other alternative. Should we just throw our hands in the air and say, well, our enemies are going to interpret this the wrong way, so there's nothing we can really do? No, we have to function through the existing institutions that have worked, by the way, for decades and centuries, and that will continue to work in the future. But we're at this unfortunate period in Western civilization, Western orders, position currently where, unfortunately, there's a severe lack of trust, and that's just the reality. But trust can be regained, of course.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The union of Russia and Belarus is uniting the two nations on a larger scale. Russia has cleared the way for Belarusians living permanently on its territory to vote in local elections and run for office.
The law, signed by Vladimir Putin on Wednesday, puts into effect changes to a previous deal meant to equalize rights for citizens living across borders. Russia's parliament signed off on the amendments earlier this month, following the lead of Belarus, where Russians already enjoy similar rights. Officials say the move will help Belarusians become more involved in public life on Russian soil. Belarusian authorities have said they would like to see the arrangement expand in the future, possibly to cover regional elections. Since the late 1990s, Moscow and Minsk have been pushing toward a union state, a long-running plan that includes shared defense, currency, and legislation.
Belarus has hinted that it may bring the upcoming Zapad 2025 military drills closer to NATO frontiers, reversing an earlier decision to stage them further inland. Minsk officials have blamed Polish and Lithuanian military activity near the border for the change in plans.
The joint Russian-Belarusian exercise, set for September, is expected to involve around 13,000 troops. Citing large-scale NATO exercises planned near Grodno, Belarus's defense ministry has indicated a possible westward shift of forces to simulate defensive scenarios.
Russian authorities have tightened border controls to prevent conscripted men from leaving the country, giving security agencies direct access to draft databases, including electronic summonses.
Men eligible for military service are now facing increased scrutiny at airports and land border crossings. Travelers who have received draft notifications are immediately detained and barred from leaving the country. The changes follow reports that men across multiple regions have started receiving digital enlistment notices. A law signed by Vladimir Putin gives electronic summonses the same legal force as paper ones and imposes automatic travel bans 7 days after the notice is sent. Those who fail to report within 20 days face additional sanctions, such as blocks on property transactions, loans, self-employment, and passport issuance.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.